James Mitchell never imagined his life would change while holding a dirty mop. At 22 years old, he had been serving as a royal guard for barely 8 months. Most days blended together in a routine of standing at attention, polishing boots, and cleaning the barracks. His friends back home in Yorkshire thought he lived a glamorous life protecting the royal family, but the reality was far different. That Tuesday morning started like any other. James woke up at 5 in the morning, to the sound of the bugle call echoing through the stone corridors of Windsor Barracks. He pulled on his uniform, straightened his red tunic, and joined the other guards for morning inspection. Sergeant Williams walked down the line of soldiers, checking each man's appearance with hawk-like eyes. James held his breath as the sergeant paused in front of him, examining his boots for any trace of dust or scuff marks. After breakfast in the mess hall, James received his assignment for the day. While other guards were posted at ceremonial positions around the castle grounds, he was given the unglamorous task of cleaning the barracks floors. He had drawn the short straw again, something that seemed to happen more often than pure chance would suggest. Some of the older guards enjoyed watching the new recruits scrub floors and clean toilets, claiming it built character. James filled his bucket with soapy water and began the tedious process of mopping the long corridor that connected the sleeping quarters to the common areas. The stone floors were always cold, even in summer, and the repetitive motion of pushing the mop back and forth made his shoulders ache. He worked methodically, starting from the far end of the hall and making his way toward the main entrance. Barracks were unusually quiet that morning. Most of the guards were either on duty at their posts or attending training exercises in the courtyard. James could hear the distant sound of marching feet and shouted commands through the thick walls. But inside the building, only his footsteps and the splash of the mop broke the silence. As he worked, James let his mind wander to thoughts of home. His mother had written him a letter the previous week, telling him about the harvest festival in their village and how proud she was of his service. His younger sister Sarah had started her first year at university, studying to become a teacher. Sometimes James wondered if he had made the right choice joining the guards instead of going to college like Sarah. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. James was careful to work around these patches of light, knowing that any streaks or water spots would be noticed during the afternoon inspection. He had learned the hard way that even the smallest imperfection could result in extra duties or a stern lecture from the officers. Around 10 o'clock, James heard the sound of heavy boots approaching from the main entrance. This was unusual, as most personnel used the side doors during the morning hours to avoid disturbing the cleaning routines. He looked up from his work to see a figure silhouetted against the bright doorway. The person wore a different uniform than the standard Royal Guard dress, with distinctive insignia that James did not immediately recognize. The stranger walked with purpose and confidence, his boots clicking against the stone floor with military precision. As he drew closer, James could make out more details of his appearance. The man was tall and lean, probably in his 30s, with short-cropped hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His uniform was immaculate, but bore the wear marks of someone who had seen real action beyond ceremonial duties. James continued mopping, trying not to stare at the approaching figure while wondering who this visitor might be. It was not uncommon for officers from other military units to visit the barracks for meetings or inspections, but something about this man's bearing suggested he was not just another administrator or liaison officer. The stranger stopped about 10 feet away from James and stood silently, observing the young guard at work. James felt the weight of the man's gaze and began to feel self-conscious about his mundane task. He tried to maintain his composure and continue cleaning as if nothing unusual was happening, but his movements became slightly more rigid and deliberate under the scrutiny. After what felt like several minutes but was probably only 30 seconds, the stranger cleared his throat and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that carried easily through the empty corridor. "Good morning, soldier," the stranger said. his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of authority mixed with genuine interest. James immediately stopped mopping and snapped to attention, nearly knocking over his bucket in the process. Water sloshed, dangerously close to the rim, threatening to undo his morning's work. "Good morning, sir," James replied, his voice slightly hoarse from the surprise. He was not sure of the proper protocol for this situation, as his training had not covered encounters with unidentified officers during cleaning duties. The man studied James for a moment, his sharp eyes taking in every detail from the young guard's posture to the way he gripped the mop handle. There was something calculating in his gaze, as if he was evaluating James for reasons that went far beyond a simple inspection of cleaning standards. "What's your name, son?" the officer asked, stepping closer. James noticed that despite his polished appearance, there were small details that set this man apart from the typical military personnel he encountered daily. His boots showed signs of extensive field use, and there was a small scar just above his left eyebrow that spoke of real combat experience. "Private James Mitchell, sir," he answered, maintaining his rigid posture despite the awkwardness of holding a mop at attention. "How long have you been with the Guards, Mitchell?" 8 months, sir." The officer nodded thoughtfully, continuing his assessment. "And before this, what did you do?" James hesitated for a moment, unsure why this information was relevant, but knowing better than to question a superior officer's inquiries. "I worked on my family's farm, sir. We raised sheep and grew barley in Yorkshire." "A farm boy," the man mused, almost to himself. "That explains the work ethic. I've been watching you clean for the past few minutes. Most soldiers would have taken shortcuts, especially when they thought no one was looking. You've been thorough and methodical." James felt heat rising in his cheeks, embarrassed by the attention, but also oddly proud that his efforts had been noticed. "Thank you, sir." The stranger walked a slow circle around James, continuing his evaluation. "Tell me, Mitchell, are you satisfied with your current duties?" This was dangerous territory. James knew that complaining about assignments could be seen as insubordination, but he also sensed that this officer was looking for an honest answer rather than the standard military response. "I serve where I'm needed, sir," James replied carefully. The man smiled slightly, recognizing the diplomatic answer. "That's what you're supposed to say. But I asked what you think, not what the manual tells you to think." James took a deep breath, making a split-second decision to trust his instincts about this unusual encounter. "I joined the Guards because I wanted to serve my country and protect people, sir. I know cleaning is important and I don't mind the work, but sometimes I wonder if I could be doing more." The officer stopped directly in front of James, fixing him with an intense stare. "More how?" "I don't know, sir. Maybe something that uses more of the skills we learned in training. Something that makes a real difference." For several seconds, the corridor fell silent, except for the distant sounds of military activity from outside. James began to worry that he had overstepped and revealed too much dissatisfaction with his current role. He had heard stories of soldiers being transferred to even less desirable positions for expressing any form of discontent. "What if I told you there might be an opportunity for exactly that kind of work?" the officer said finally, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone. James felt his heart rate increase. "I would be very interested, sir. It wouldn't be easy. It would require additional training, physical demands beyond what you've experienced so far, and the kind of responsibility that most soldiers never face. Are you willing to be challenged in ways that might push you to your absolute limits?" Without hesitation, James nodded. "Yes, sir." The officer reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card, holding it between two fingers. "My name is Captain David Harrison. I'm with a specialized unit that recruits from various branches of the military. We look for soldiers who demonstrate specific qualities: integrity, dedication, physical capability, and the mental toughness to handle situations that most people never encounter." James stared at the card, his mind racing with possibilities. And questions. "I've been observing personnel at this base for the past week," Captain Harrison continued. "Your name came up in several conversations with your training instructors and supervising officers. They spoke highly of your character and potential, even if your current assignments don't reflect that potential." The captain extended the card toward James. "If you're serious about wanting to do more, be in Conference Room C at 1400 hours today. Come alone and don't discuss this conversation with anyone else. Is that understood?" James took the card with trembling fingers, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The small white card bore only Captain Harrison's name and a phone number, with no indication of what unit or organization he represented. "Yes, sir. I understand." Captain Harrison studied James's face one more time, as if making a final assessment. "Good. Finish your cleaning duties and carry on with your normal routine until this afternoon. Remember, discretion is essential." With that, the captain turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the corridor until they faded completely. James stood motionless for several minutes, the card clutched in his hand and the mop forgotten beside him. The encounter felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than his mundane reality as a royal guard. Eventually, James shook himself back to awareness and returned to his cleaning duties. However, his movements were now mechanical and distracted. His mind kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word and gesture for clues about what might await him in Conference Room C. He had passed that room countless times during his months at the barracks, but had never been inside. It was typically used for officer meetings and administrative briefings. The remaining hours of the morning crawled by at an agonizing pace. James tried to focus on his tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting to Captain Harrison's words about specialized units and additional training. He wondered what kind of work would require the qualities the captain had mentioned. The emphasis on physical demands and mental toughness suggested something far more challenging than ceremonial guard duty. During lunch in the mess hall, James sat with his usual group of fellow guards, but he found it difficult to participate in their conversation. His friends talked about their weekend plans, complained about their officers, and shared gossip about personnel changes within the regiment. James nodded and smiled at appropriate moments, but his responses were distracted and brief. "You're quiet today, Mitchell," observed Private Thompson, one of the older guards who had taken James under his wing when he first arrived. "Everything all right?" James forced a more genuine smile. "Just tired, I suppose." "Long morning of cleaning," Thompson laughed. "At least you didn't have to stand at attention for 3 hours while tourists took pictures. My feet are killing me." The conversation moved on to other topics, but James noticed Thompson watching him with concern throughout the meal. He made an effort to appear more engaged, asking questions about the afternoon's assignments and sharing a story about a letter from home. The last thing he needed was for anyone to suspect that something unusual had happened that morning. After lunch, James had a brief period of free time before reporting for his afternoon duties. He retreated to his bunk and lay down, staring at the card Captain Harrison had given him. He tried to imagine what the meeting might entail and what questions he might be asked. The captain had mentioned integrity and mental toughness, which suggested some form of evaluation or interview process. James also found himself thinking about his motivations for joining the military. He had enlisted partly out of a sense of duty and patriotism, but also because he felt restless and unfulfilled working on the family farm. The routine of rural life, while peaceful and stable, had left him yearning for something more meaningful and challenging. His current role as a royal guard had provided structure and purpose, but not the sense of making a real difference that he had hoped for. At exactly 2 o'clock, James made his way to Conference Room C. The hallway was empty, and he could hear his heartbeat as he approached the door. He knocked twice and waited for a response. "Enter," came Captain Harrison's voice from inside. James opened the door and stepped into a small, windowless room furnished with a conference table and several chairs. Captain Harrison sat at the far end of the table with several folders and documents spread out in front of him. He was no longer alone. Two other men in civilian clothes flanked him, both studying James with the same intense scrutiny he had experienced that morning. "Close the door and have a seat, Mitchell," Captain Harrison instructed, gesturing to a chair directly across from him. James did as instructed, trying to maintain his composure despite the formal atmosphere and the weight of 3 pairs of eyes, examining his every movement. The silence stretched for several seconds before Captain Harrison spoke again. "Before we begin, I need to confirm that you haven't discussed this morning's encounter with anyone else." "No, sir. I haven't spoken to anyone about it." One of the civilian-dressed men made a note on a pad of paper. James noticed that despite their casual clothing, both men carried themselves with military bearing and showed the same signs of field experience he had observed in Captain Harrison. "Good. What I'm about to share with you is classified information. Even if you decide not to proceed with what we're offering, you are bound by official secrets and cannot discuss any part of this conversation with anyone. Do you understand the implications of that?" James felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Yes, sir. I understand." Captain Harrison leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "I represent the Special Air Service, Mitchell. The SAS recruits exceptional individuals from across the military for operations that require the highest levels of skill, dedication, and discretion." The words hit James like a physical blow. The SAS was legendary within military circles, known for their elite training and dangerous missions around the world. Stories of their exploits were whispered in barracks and mess halls, but most soldiers considered joining their ranks as likely as becoming an astronaut. "You're probably wondering why we're interested in a royal guard who spends his mornings mopping floors," continued one of the civilian-dressed men, speaking for the first time. His accent suggested origins in Scotland, and his weathered hands bore old scars that spoke of field experience. James nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "We don't just look at current assignments when evaluating potential recruits," the Scottish man explained. "We examine character, adaptability, and underlying potential. Your training instructors noted your exceptional performance in marksmanship, physical fitness, and tactical scenarios. Your supervising officers praised your reliability and attention to detail, even in mundane tasks." Captain Harrison picked up one of the folders from the table and opened it, revealing what appeared to be James's complete service record along with additional documents he didn't recognize. "More importantly, we conducted background investigations that revealed qualities we value highly. Your family and former employers consistently described you as trustworthy, hardworking, and capable of handling responsibility under pressure." The Yati third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a crisp London accent. "Tell us about the incident with the injured hiker last year before you enlisted." James was surprised by the reference to an event he had nearly forgotten. "There was a man who fell while climbing in the Yorkshire Dales near our farm. He had broken his leg and was stranded in bad weather. The rescue services couldn't reach him because of fog and high winds." "What did you do?" the London man prompted. "I hiked up to find him after my father and I saw his distress flares. The terrain was dangerous, especially in the storm, but I managed to reach him and provide first aid. I stayed with him through the night, keeping him warm and stable until the rescue helicopter could get through in the morning. That rescue took place in near-freezing conditions with visibility of less than 50 meters, Captain Harrison noted, reading from his folder. The rescue team leader stated that without your intervention, the man would likely have died from exposure." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I just did what needed to be done, sir," the Scottish man smiled slightly. "That's exactly the kind of response we're looking for. No dramatics, no false heroics, just practical action when others needed help." Captain Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at James. The SAS is currently conducting recruitment for a new training cycle. The selection process is grueling, and most candidates don't complete it successfully. Those who do earn the right to participate in operations that most people never hear about, protecting national security interests in ways that rarely make headlines. The training will push you beyond any physical and mental limits you've experienced, the London man added. You'll learn skills that most soldiers never encounter: advanced combat techniques, survival in hostile environments, intelligence gathering, and specialized weapon systems. James felt his pulse quickening with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was an opportunity he had never imagined possible, but it also represented a leap into the unknown that could change his life completely. "We're not asking for an immediate decision," Captain Harrison continued, "but we need to know if you're genuinely interested in pursuing this path. If you are, the first step is a preliminary selection weekend that will give you a taste of what's full training involves." The Scottish man leaned back in his chair. "We should be clear about what you'd be giving up. Royal Guard duty, while not glamorous, is safe and predictable. SAS operations involve real danger, extended deployments away from family and friends, and the kind of stress that some people never fully recover from. On the other hand," the London man added, "you'd be working with the best soldiers in the world on missions that genuinely matter for national security. The training and experience you'd gain would be unlike anything available in conventional military service." Captain Harrison studied James's face carefully. "What questions do you have for us?" James's mind was racing with dozens of questions, but he tried to focus on the most important ones. "How long is the training process?" "Initial selection is approximately 6 months, assuming you pass each phase," Captain Harrison replied. "Full operational readiness takes additional specialized training that can extend for another year or more, depending on your assigned role." "What happens if I don't complete the training successfully?" "You'd return to your current unit with no negative marks on your record," the Scottish man assured him. "Failed selection isn't considered a career setback. Many excellent soldiers simply aren't suited for this type of work." James took a deep breath, feeling the magnitude of the decision before him. "I'm interested," James said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "When would this preliminary selection weekend take place?" Captain Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. "Next weekend, starting Friday. Evening. You would be granted special leave from your current duties, with a cover story about attending an advanced weapons training course." The London man opened a briefcase beside his chair and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "This contains detailed instructions for where to report, what to bring, and what to expect during the initial evaluation. Study it carefully, but remember that all information is classified." James accepted the envelope, feeling its weight as both a physical object and a symbol of the commitment he was making. "Is there anything I should do to prepare?" "Continue your normal fitness routine," the Scottish man advised. "Get plenty of rest and don't try to cram in extra training. We're more interested in your natural capabilities and decision-making under stress than your ability to prepare for specific challenges." Captain Harrison stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "Mitchell, I want you to understand that this conversation represents only the very beginning of a long and difficult process. Many soldiers who show promise in preliminary discussions don't make it through even the first week of actual selection." The three men began gathering their papers and folders, but Captain Harrison paused and looked directly at James. "However, something about your profile suggests you might have what we're looking for. The combination of practical skills, mental toughness, and genuine character is rarer than you might think." James stood as well, still clutching the envelope. "Thank you for this opportunity, sir. I won't let you down." "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep," the Scottish man said with a slight smile. "Just do your best and see what happens." The London man handed James a card similar to the one Captain Harrison had given him that morning. "If you have any urgent questions before Friday, you can reach me at this number. Otherwise, follow the instructions in the envelope and report as directed." After the three men left, James remained in the conference room for several minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. Less than 12 hours ago, his biggest concern had been avoiding streaks on the barracks floor. Now he was holding classified documents about joining the most elite military unit in the country. When he finally returned to his quarters, James found his roommate, Private Collins, preparing for evening inspection. Collins was a cheerful young man from Wales who had joined the Guards around the same time as James, and they had become close friends during their months of service together. "Where have you been?" Collins asked. "I looked for you after afternoon duties, but Sergeant Williams said you were attending some kind of meeting." James had anticipated this question and had prepared a response during his walk back from the conference room. "Just a review of my performance records with one of the administrative officers. Nothing important." Collins nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, but James felt uncomfortable lying to his friend. The secrecy required by his new situation would mean creating distance between himself and the people he had grown to trust and rely on. That evening, James waited until Collins was asleep before carefully opening the manila envelope Captain Harrison had given him. The instructions were detailed and specific, covering everything from transportation arrangements to required equipment. He read through the documents twice, memorizing the key details and timeline. The preliminary selection would take place at a remote training facility in Wales, beginning Friday at 6 in the evening and concluding Sunday afternoon. Participants would undergo physical fitness tests, psychological evaluations, basic tactical scenarios, and what the documents described as stress inoculation exercises. The language was deliberately vague, but James understood that he would face challenges designed to test his limits in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. Over the next few days, James struggled to maintain his normal routine while his mind constantly returned to the upcoming weekend. He found himself studying his fellow guards differently, wondering which of them might also possess the qualities that had caught the SAS recruiter's attention. He also began paying closer attention to his own responses to stress and pressure, trying to understand what had impressed Captain Harrison during their brief encounter. On Wednesday morning, while once again mopping the barracks floors, James reflected on the irony of his situation. The mundane task that had initially seemed like a symbol of his limited role within the military had actually been the setting for the most important opportunity of his life. He wondered if Captain Harrison had known that observing him during cleaning duties would provide insights into his character that couldn't be gleaned from formal interviews or training exercises. Thursday evening, James packed the required equipment. According to the detailed list in his instructions, the items were standard military gear that wouldn't attract attention from his roommate or other personnel, but seeing them laid out together made the reality of his situation more concrete. In less than 24 hours, he would be on his way to find out whether his dreams of serving in a more meaningful capacity could become reality. As he prepared for sleep on Thursday night, James thought about his family back in Yorkshire. His parents would be proud that he was being considered for an elite unit, but they would also worry about the increased danger and responsibility. His sister Sarah would probably tease him about becoming too secretive and serious, the way she had when he first enlisted. For now, though, those conversations would have to wait. James had committed himself to a path that required secrecy and sacrifice, and he was determined to prove worthy of the trust Captain Harrison had shown by offering him this chance. Friday afternoon arrived with an unseasonably cold rain that matched James's nervous energy. He had been granted leave as promised, with his official records showing attendance at an advanced marksmanship course. Collins had wished him luck that morning, joking that he hoped the training would be more exciting than their usual duties. The journey to Wales took several hours by train and bus, following a route specified in his classified instructions. James traveled in civilian clothes, carrying a simple duffel bag that contained his military gear and personal items. The final leg of the trip was a bus ride through remote countryside that reminded him of the hills near his family's farm. The training facility was smaller and more austere than James had expected. A collection of low buildings surrounded by high fences and warning signs, it looked more like a research station than a military base. He reported to the main gate at exactly 6 o'clock, where a guard checked his identification against a list, and directed him to Building C inside. James found 12 other soldiers from various military units, all looking as nervous and uncertain as he felt. They ranged in age from early 20s to mid-30s and represented different branches of service and specialties. What they shared was a certain intensity and alertness that James recognized from his encounter with Captain Harrison. The group was addressed by a stern-looking warrant officer who explained the basic rules and schedule for the weekend. They would be divided into small teams for most exercises, evaluated both individually and as groups, and subjected to progressively more challenging scenarios designed to test their capabilities under stress. "Some of you will decide this isn't for you," the warrant officer stated bluntly. "Others will be told that decision has been made for them. Either outcome is acceptable and reflects no shame on your service or character. The SAS requires specific qualities that not every good soldier possesses." The first evening consisted of medical examinations, psychological questionnaires, and basic fitness assessments. James performed well on the physical tests, drawing on months of daily exercise and the natural strength developed during years of farm work. The psychological evaluations were more challenging, consisting of interviews and written tests designed to probe his motivations, decision-making processes, and ability to handle pressure. Saturday brought more intensive challenges. James found himself crawling through muddy obstacle courses, solving complex tactical problems with limited information, and enduring what the instructors called controlled stress situations. These involved being shouted at, given contradictory orders, and forced to make critical decisions while exhausted and disoriented. The most difficult exercise took place Saturday evening. James and 3 other candidates were placed in a simulated hostage rescue scenario, given minimal equipment and briefing, and told to develop and execute a plan within strict time limits. The exercise tested not only their tactical skills, but their ability to work as a team under extreme pressure. James's group succeeded in rescuing the hostages, but only after making several mistakes that would have been fatal in a real situation. The instructor's debriefing was thorough and harsh, highlighting every error in judgment and execution. However, James noticed that the criticism was constructive rather than purely negative, focusing on how performance could be improved rather than simply identifying failures. Sunday morning brought the final evaluation, which took the form of individual interviews with a panel of SAS officers. James faced 3 men, including Captain Harrison, who questioned him about his performance during the weekend, his understanding of what SAS service would entail, and his commitment to pursuing the full selection process. "You've shown promise. This weekend," Captain Harrison told him. "Your physical capabilities are adequate, and your performance in team exercises suggests good instincts for tactical thinking. More importantly, you maintained composure and continued functioning effectively, even when facing situations well outside your previous experience." One of the other officers leaned forward. "However, promise isn't the same as capability. Full selection will be far more demanding than anything you've experienced this weekend. Are you prepared for 6 months of training that will test every aspect of your physical, mental, and emotional resilience?" James thought about his answer carefully before responding. The weekend had given him a taste of what lay ahead, and he understood that he was committing to something that would change him fundamentally, regardless of whether he ultimately succeeded. "Yes, sir. I want to find out what I'm truly capable of, and I believe this is the way to do it." The panel exchanged glances before Captain Harrison spoke again. "Full selection begins in 3 weeks. You'll return to your unit until then and continue your normal duties without discussing any aspect of this process. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Captain Harrison stood and extended his hand toward James. As they shook hands, the captain's expression became slightly more personal. 3 weeks ago, I watched you mopping a floor with the same attention to detail and commitment that you've shown this weekend. That consistency of character is one of the qualities we value most highly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a rifle, a standard-issue SA-80 that gleamed with fresh cleaning and maintenance. This weapon represents the tools you'll master if you complete selection successfully. But more importantly, it represents the trust we place in those who earn the right to carry it in service of their country. As Captain Harrison took a knee and formally presented the rifle to James, the young soldier felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The ceremony was simple but profound, marking his transition from a royal guard who cleaned floors to a candidate for the most elite military unit in the nation. Congratulations on being accepted for full selection, Mitchell. Don't let us down. James accepted the rifle with steady hands, knowing that his life had irrevocably changed. The boy who had mopped barracks floors just days earlier was gone, replaced by someone ready to discover the limits of his own potential in service of something greater than himself.